What I would like to talk to you today is sort of a summation and a culmination of most of my work, going from, as Mike was saying, entomology and conservation, evolutionary biology of beetles living with ants, that's what it was about, cool story by itself, to now working with communities. I've retrained myself over the last 10 years to become a conservation psychologist, and I'll share with you a little bit about what that means. But what I want to try to share with you all is a story about why killing poachers is not the answer, and why what we often see on social media, people celebrating the demise of poachers, is actually contrary to what we want as conservationists. So, a show of hands first. How many of you would identify as a conservationist, a person who's an advocate for conservation? Fantastic. Thank you all for everything that you do to make our natural world better protected, better preserved, better appreciated. It takes a nation of millions to make that happen, a world of millions. But what we want to be able to talk about is the diversity of species that are at threat around the world is massive. We've all heard about all these losses of songbirds, 3 trillion fewer songbirds in North America over a few decades ago. 13 times the number of ravens, which is a little ironic, in the desert, which leads to the demise of many other species, including, of course, the desert tortoise. We at the Living Desert are a conservation organization, an education organization, and also an animal care organization. And we work on 35 conservation projects in 10 countries, mostly focused, as Mike was saying, on North America and in Africa. And in North America, the species that we focus on are, of course, the desert tortoise. We're the voice of the desert tortoise across its entire range. We speak to the public. We are the Lorax for the tortoise. We also work with the Western pond turtle conservation. This fantastically sexy boy, which is a Casey's June beetle that it's found only in one stretch of Palm Springs, of Palm Canyon. 3 miles, nowhere else in the entire world. Palm Springs' own species, right? So I think this new hockey team that we're getting, here's the name. It's Casey's June beetle, the Palm Springs Casey's June beetles. The fighting beetles. They're not all numbered 18. Some of them are numbered 19. It's a funny thing. No, I'm kidding. We write that. We work with helping to bring back the pronghorn to California, where they have not been for almost a century. In a few years, we will have pronghorn back in Southern California, thanks to our efforts and those of our great partners at Fish and Wildlife Service. The vaquita, an animal that is near and dear to my heart, with whom I've been working for about 8 years now in the upper Gulf of California. We'll return to this study, or this story, in a second. And then in Africa, across Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, and a little bit of Sub-Saharan Africa, we work with many cheetah projects. We have 3. How many of you heard Mary Wickstra talk from Kenya? Fabulous talk. She's one of our major partners. We love her. We help with reintroducing the scimitar-horned oryx into Chad. We care for and actually breed quite prodigiously the African wild dogs, or painted dogs you may have heard, or African wolves. We also work with, in Tanzania, the giraffe, elephants, and rhinos with Wild Nature Institute. We work with, in Kenya, the Southern Rangelands Landowners Association. Some of you may have heard Guy Western talk this morning, or this summer, here at the zoo, or at the library, rather. Did anybody hear that? Amazing talk. Great presentation. Wonderful person, too. Great organization. And then in South Africa, we work with the Black Mamba's Anti-Poaching Unit, which is a story to benefit the black rhino and white rhinos, as well as several other species, and I'll return to this story as well in a moment. So we work around the world, mostly on these 2 continents, and so to sort of talk about this story about why killing poachers is not the best way forward to further conservation, I want to focus on these 2 species, these 2 stories, one from North America and one from Africa. We'll start with the vaquita. How many of you have heard of the vaquita? Almost everyone, but not everyone. Okay, good. So an opportunity for learning for all of us, or many of us. So the vaquita is a porpoise. It's the smallest porpoise in the world, only at maturity about 4 feet long. smaller than an adult man. When they're a baby, they're about this size, actually, a little bigger when they come out. Are found only in the upper Gulf of California, between Baja and Sonora states. And this is their range. This red is the whole of their range, which is not very big at all. This is San Felipe. Some of you may have gone down here along this road that comes up through Mexicali, Golfo de Santa Clara, and Puerto Peñasco over on the what would that be, east side of the Gulf. These three communities are based in fishing. And for a very long time, most of their money came from fishing for shrimp in this area where the Colorado River would empty into the upper Gulf. It was a massively productive area when the river was flowing, or when the river does flow. Produces lots of animals, lots of shrimp, and they would catch those shrimp with gill nets, which is kind of contrary because shrimp don't have gills in the same way that fish do. But they would get caught in the nets. Unfortunately, the vaquita, when it hits a net, the first thing that it does is it hits the net and then it rolls. And you can easily see how parts of it would get caught in the net. And the vaquita is, of course, not a fish, so it's a mammal. It must breathe, and it would drown when it gets caught in the nets, right? It's a massive problem. And so there's a biodiversity preserve that's been designated for the benefit of the vaquita refuge in yellow. The larger biopreserve is also the range of the vaquita, as well as many other species. And in this area, from well south of San Felipe, including all of the Golfo de Santa Clara and really the fishing grounds for Puerto Peñasco, gill nets were banned a few years ago. Could not use gill nets. How do you think people fish in the upper Gulf of California? Gill nets. Really no other way. Sport fishers will use lines and hooks, but almost everything that's done commercially is done with gill nets or trawls. And very much more recently, the fishing for a very large fish, it's called a drum, it's a type of drum or a croaker if you're a fish nerd, like some of us are. I can fall into that sometimes. It's called the totoaba, coexists with the vaquita. It's about the same size. And historically, they were fished for their meat. But in the last few years, the swim bladder has become highly praised as a delicacy, as an important part of, let's say, Chinese medicine, but also as a delicacy, as a swim bladder soup, fish maw soup, in China and Vietnam and other countries. But unfortunately, catching these species, which are themselves critically endangered in the upper Gulf of California, will guarantee to catch a vaquita. The vaquita are the same size as the totoaba. So if it's going to catch a totoaba, it's going to catch a vaquita. Guaranteed, right? So the numbers of the vaquita have been declining pretty precipitously since this type of fishing has really taken effect. So much so that at present, we have fewer than a dozen vaquita that exist in the world. Fewer than a dozen vaquita. It's a tragedy of gigantic proportions. And only in the last few years has this really ramped up, as you can see, right? Just the last 5 years, 10 years. A few years ago, I was down in the upper Gulf. Oh, excuse me. A few years ago, I was down in the upper Gulf, and we tried to take out the last few vaquita that remained and bring them into human care, into areas of the Gulf that would be fenced off to protect them so that they could breed, restore their population size. We could remove the drift nets, which are often laid out, or regular gill nets that were laid out and then forgotten, or people cut and left behind when they were in danger of being arrested, killing indiscriminately, years and years. So we had hoped to be able to take the vaquita, bring them into human care so that they could breed. And I was part of the team that went down there. I was there for the couple months that we were down there. And it failed miserably. Some animals are not right for human care. They are a very sensitive, beautiful, beautiful animal, but incredibly sensitive. And they have heart attacks when they're in our care. When we think we're caring for them, we are caring for them. So we had one die in our hands, and when she died, we called off that rescue mission. It's a tragedy. And it's for this that's fueling this. This is the swim bladder of the totoaba. The totoaba, while critically endangered, breed well in human care. Scientists make thousands of totoaba on an annual basis in tanks. On land, release them back into the water, which is fantastic for the totoaba because the populations can rebound despite the poaching. Can you imagine what the effects of artificially increasing a population of one, the totoaba, while not affecting the population of the other, the vaquita? We're artificially fueling the black market by releasing the totoaba back into the ocean, right? So there's so many more totoaba fueling the trade, the vaquita, innocent bystanders, declining. And this is why that decline that we saw earlier is happening. Right? So you can feel the emotions, right? I mean, it's something there, right? And so often on social media, we'll see people respond to this emotion, and many of us are a bit more aggressive than those who tend to tear up, and advocate violence against the people who are doing the poaching in pretty dramatic and graphic ways, right? RPG is a rocket-propelled grenade. That would be effective for that goal. So, that response to that tragedy is understandable. Although, again, counterproductive for conservation for reasons I'll get to in a moment. So now, going to that second story of rhinos, one of my other loves is there black rhinos. I started this Helping Rhinos organization in the U.S. We had existed before in the U.K. for 3 years. I was the branch, I guess, or the franchise. We were when we started here in the U.S. a couple of years ago, 3 years ago. Our goal is to try to fuel community-based conservation efforts, like Mike was saying in the introduction. These are amazing animals. What's driving it, their decline, and they're declining, most of them, is that they are twice as valuable as gold. Rhino horn. Twice as valuable as gold. Think about that. Right? People kill each other over gold. How about for something that's twice as valuable as that? Mostly, of course, for traditional Asian medicine, they'll take the horn, they grind it up, and then the powder is put out in a soup or sometimes in wine, often as a status symbol. If you're wealthy enough that you can afford a rhino horn, you want to show it off. It's like when you have a top rack bottle of wine and you want to share it with your guests. Same thing, right? We often say mistakenly that it's because people in East Asia use it as a let's say a man's problem solution. Just leave it at that. And that's actually not the case. That hasn't been the case. In Asia, in China in particular, it's viewed as a way to remediate against aches and pains, like an aspirin, right? Like an aspirin. They've heard us saying, oh, the Chinese use it as an erectile dysfunction solution. And they say, oh, it's used for that too, great. Let me put some of that in my wine. Right? And so now it's become, it was not. We shared that information, or perspective, let's say. In addition to that, and before that became such a huge problem, in Yemen, they used to make the dagger of knives, called jamias, out of rhino horn. This bit. That is no longer the case because Yemen unilaterally said, this is wrong. We are not going to use rhino horn to make the daggers of something as important as our ceremonial dagger that all of us, all the men have to have. They all wear it in the sash. It's really an awesome looking thing, right? And so in 1 year, they went from being the world's largest consumer of rhino horn to not even on the map as a rhino horn consumer because they made that decision. It's amazing, right? Shows the value of a thoughtful leadership of a country. 1 year. Number 1 to non-existent. Rhino horn, made out of the same thing as our hair or your fingernails. This of a broken rhino horn where they've run into a fence. Actually, this isn't anything violence by us. This is rhino on horn or rhino on fence violence. You can see that it is very stringy, just like your fingernails or your hair or something like that, right? So when I give this kind of a talk in a very different way to kids, I say, if you have friends who use rhino horn, you could tell them, it's just as effective as chewing your nails. You should chew your nails for conservation. They independently, they almost always come up with that solution, that slogan. Chew your nails for conservation. This is both a tragedy and a huge success story. Very often, of course, when rhinos are poached, they're poached because the poachers kill them, and then while they're down, they hack off their face. And terribly graphic, but that's how they do it. Hack it off, usually with machetes, pangas. Nandi, over here, is a poaching survivor. She was poached, as were 2 of the males that were with her. All 3 survived the initial poaching incident. 2 males died, one immediately after, and the other one a week after because of the trauma. One can imagine why. She survived. The hope here, she's had 3 calves, despite this traumatic thing. 3 calves. They do. They got a little horn, a little incipient horn, right? So the poaching crisis is a real thing. This is just data from South Africa alone, which has about 75% of the world's rhinos of any species in one country. 75% in one country, just South Africa. A lot of them are in game farms or reserves, those kinds of things. Ecotourism lodges. How many people have been to South Africa to one of those lodges? Awesome place, right? Amazing place. I love South Africa. You can see early 2007, early 2008, about the same time that the vaquita decline started. Let's file that away in the back of the mind. We'll come back to that. This massive increase in poaching. Right? Loss of rhinos. This last year, in 2018, dramatic drop. And this year, we're on pace, this is half of the year, these 2019 numbers, be a little lower than even last year. Many people credit this to better surveillance, better anti-poaching efforts, education and outreach things. It's a diffuse set of solutions, mostly focused on the range countries where the rhinos originate, but also in China. China passed a rhino horn ban only a few years ago, right? About this year. Poaching's still a big problem, though, because there are not very many of them, right? You take in 1,000 rhinos a year, we have maybe around 28,000 animals left in the world, in all 5 species, right? That's a pretty major drop every year, 1,000 individuals. Most of those poached are white rhinos, so their numbers are declining. Javan and Sumatran rhinos are actually staying stable. This number I should have changed. I just read this year there's been many births, so they're almost up to 90, which is kind of great. But both, less than 100, about as many people as we have in the room here for all of one species. Half as many as we have between the two species. Indian rhinos are growing in number, which is amazing. Not hugely. There's about 3,600 of them that are in existence in the wild, which is pretty great, right? And black rhinos, from when I made this slide 2 years ago, which I need to desperately update, are up to about 5,800. Black rhinos are increasing. Black rhinos are really the biggest gainers of any of the 5 species. So black and Indian are increasing in population size, decreasing to staying stable, and more or less staying stable for these other 2. So it's not the greatest story, right? And the reason for this is, of course, the poaching, which I'm going to take off the slide right away because that was the least graphic of the rhino poaching photos I could find online. And all of mine are terribly graphic, so I didn't want to share with you any of those. And seeing an animal in the state that you usually find these rhinos, which I won't go into any further, is one of the most traumatic things I have ever witnessed. And I've been in a lot of car crashes, and this is incredible. So you can see why people who care about rhinos might respond pretty strongly, right? It's a real threat to the species. It's tremendously graphic and violent, the act. And you can see why people will say poachers will be poached. Why, when these sorts of things happen, and maybe poachers are killed, that was in India, people might have celebratory statements similar to what we were talking about with the vaquita, where they celebrate the death of them. They must dehorn them and take the photos. Great job, excellent, yippee, finally, something good. The death of 4 men for whom their families are now without a father. So this is the kind of response that we usually get when we talk about poaching. We got to arm more people. We need more people with bigger guns and better detection abilities out in the wild, and we need them to poach the poachers. Right? It's a logical response for a lot of people. This, of course, where those hunters, poachers, come from is not well received, right? If you live near a protected area where there are rhinos, or as I'll get to a vaquita, and you are told that if you go into this area and you hunt a rhino, we will kill you. Are they going to be an advocate for rhino conservation? Right? Are they going to be a voice for the voiceless? Are they going to be the Lorax for the rhino? Huh? And this is in San Felipe. Apologies for the pixelated photo. People talk about vandalizing the boats as a kind way to address the vaquita problem. We talked about RPGs earlier. And in San Felipe, they have the same kind of response as did those angry people. A couple slides back. This is, we're pushing for the liberation of Sunshine Rodriguez, who, from the vaquita perspective, is probably Totoaba poacher number 1. This is what I've been told. People are supporting this person who is leading to the decline and advocating for the decline of this species. Many fishers, not all, there are amazingly great, supportive, pro-conservation fishers in the upper Gulf of California, too. Not like Sunshine. Sunshine is the minority, really. But there are very violent and active and aggressive fishers that are pushing for the extinction of the vaquita. Because when the vaquita goes extinct, we can finally fish. Because they can't fish right now. They can't use gill nets. That's how most of them all make their living, right? It's as if someone is coming into your house or your neighborhood, and they say, however you all make your living, sorry, no more. Here's some handouts from the government for a while until we decide not to continue that, because we don't usually continue that, which is what's happened in the Upper Gulf, right? Take away the opportunities for livelihood of an entire community for the benefit of this thing that people often, I think disingenuously, question the existence of. They're not going to be your biggest advocate for the conservation of anything, right? You know, I know what you did to us with the vaquita. I don't care what you say about the pronghorn, right? I don't believe you. So, we're enraging people. We are not engaging people when we advocate for the death of poachers, right? These are the people who live in and around where these amazing species live. And if we say all poachers should be shot on sight, and we condemn countries like Botswana that until recently had that policy and then reversed it, we're creating this adversarial, I hate all wildlife because you're telling me I can't protect my farm kind of relationship, right? So, keep those thoughts in mind. Why are most species around the world declining? This should be a softball answer. Habitat loss. Why else? Climate change. How about something that is the source, the cause for all that? Us. Right? We are the reason why species are declining. I had this map up earlier. This is the Human Impact Index. It was from my, not alma mater, but where I used to teach. So can I call it my alma mater? Sure, thank you, I appreciate that. I couldn't have got in there as an undergraduate, but I got to teach there and be a professor there for a while. So, whoo! That worked out well. This is from Columbia University, CSEN, the Center for Earth Information Systems Network. And it shows the greatest impacts in the world on nature in red, less intense in yellow, and then least impacts in this darker green. Right? Look at that in Botswana. Nice bright green. Across the Sahara, where, good God, nobody can live anyway. Because, God, that's like 115, 120 every day. Who the heck would live there? Right? Those people are crazy. And for the people who will see this on YouTube, I am in the Coachella Valley where we have that every summer. We are those crazy people who live in a climate very much like this. So we are the cause of why species are declining. Humans, we writ large, right? We're the cause. So if we look at the history of conservation, how we used to do conservation historically was we would take areas and we would fence them off. And before we fenced them off, we kicked everyone who was living on it off. Native Americans, Aboriginals in Australia, African tribes, people around the world, around the country, continent, wherever. And then we'd say, this area is protected. It's saved. Right? Of course, they're living all around the borders because they're not going to move that far from where they were living because they know that area and that's where they're comfortable living, right? So this was conservation in the past. Then we talked about, well, what are the drivers for why species are declining? Species seem to be declining despite us having protected all this land. Like, oh, well, us, right? All the things that we do or make happen from our resource use. And then in the early 2000s, and I was part of the people who was kind of advancing this field, was sort of the value of nature for people. Like, if you save nature, you'll have more water, you'll have more crops, you'll make more money, your air will be cleaner. Who doesn't want that, right? This ecosystem services kind of thing. All of these three, as the graph shows, continues to the present, all these three strains so far. in the last decade or so has been a shift of which that I've kind of going from entomologist to working with people, I've been making my own myself, which is that people and nature have to live together because we are a part of nature. Even here in our crazy Coachella Valley with our crazy heat, we are a part of nature when we're hiding in the summer inside of our houses in our air conditioning. Right? So we're still a part of nature, and we're still having impacts on nature, even if we're not going out during the summer, or in the northern hemisphere, or in the colder areas during the winter. This is where I work. This socio-ecological systems and interdisciplinary social and ecological sciences. People working together to get the best out of nature for people and for nature, so that both win, right? And this is called a bunch of names, or different people call it different things. What I call it is community-based conservation engagement. And there's a scientific discipline that I teach a class in called conservation psychology at CSU San Marcos. Same thing. Both have the same kind of goal, right? Which is pro-environmental behavior change that is locally appropriate and locally acceptable, right? Locally appropriate and locally acceptable. So it's effective, it's going to benefit nature, it's going to benefit the people, and it's going to be culturally compliant with the people locally. So we're not coming in from outside and saying, I've got a solution for you, you need to do this. Right? We're saying, why would this be of value to you? Why would you want to support this? Would you want to support this? And then work from there. We co-create things, right? So our theory of change, this is a fun geeky term that I like to use because I'm a geek, which is that as we increase engagement and education and involvement and familiarity of people with the environment and its species, all sorts of good things happen, right? Sustainability, there's greater support for conservation, and that all leads to what conservationists are most interested in, which is species conservation. Right? This is what we hope to have happen by engaging people in this way. So the benefits of community-based conservation engagement, CBCE, are many. To conservation, which is why I think probably many of us here would be most interested in this, is that it makes conservation more effective. And it makes conservation more effective because it addresses the cause, not just the symptoms. Right? So if we come back to the ravens problem that we have with desert tortoises, so many ravens around, overpopulated, they're eating everything, but especially baby tortoises and other nesting bird babies and lots of other things. We could go out and we could shoot ravens. We can't because they're protected by the Migratory Bird Act, so don't, please. You'll be arrested. But that's not going to address the problem, right? The problem is the number of ravens being born. And so if we can reduce the amount of food subsidies and water subsidies and habitat subsidies that we provide by leaving our dumpsters open at restaurants or our trash uncovered or our lawn being overwatered and water running down the drain or curb, there will be less resources available for ravens, and we will get at the cause. Not just the solution, or not just the symptom, right? And it becomes sustainable, our conservation projects, because people are invested in the project, they want to care about it, they benefit by it, they want it to continue. So if we're coming in from outside, which we almost always are, even if we're in our own community, we're still coming in as an advocate for something, and therefore it puts us on the outside of it. If we can make it so that people care and they are invested in it, it's their program, it's their solution, it's their solution. They own it. They will want to continue it. Right? And to the people, of course, there's better self-determination. How many people like to be told, you must do this? Everybody loves this, right? How many of you are HOA members? That's what you're being told. You got to do this. So clearly you're okay with it to a degree. I am as well. Right? Nobody really likes being told what to do. Nobody. And if we come in from outside and we say, this is the solution, you're going to do this, you're going to do that, and you can't do this anymore, and you have to change your lifestyle because of this, they will not support you. If they can be brought in and they make the decisions as to what they want to do, they'll have ownership. They can guide and direct the interventions. They can own the project. They'll therefore support the project. And very often, and very frequently, they get a job and they have income that comes from that as well. So not only are they not being told what to do, they're benefiting materially, right? So what are some examples of this highfalutin kind of theory of change malarkey? Boy, that's a mix of cultures, isn't it? Highfalutin and malarkey. One is that community collaboration to plan how they want to use the resource. They have a forest around, this group of women. How are they going to take the wood from the forest in a way so that it'll always be there, we'll always be able to extract resources to a degree? They decide. We provide the opportunity, some expertise, some skills. They decide what works. We work with communities, mostly Tanzanians. That's Mike Chadester. Mike and I were down there in May. He makes a good, very convincing Tanzanian, I think. So that they can go out and they share the good news, and they share, and they coordinate, and they cooperate, and they determine their future, right? They lead the discussion. Also, creating jobs, very important. I said earlier, one of the projects that we do at the zoo is the black rhino kind of conservation things with the Black Mamba's anti-poaching unit. Awesome group of women. If you have not seen them before, please check them out online. They are all over the place. Check in Black Mamba's Women. It'll come up. A lot of things, links to our zoo and to helping rhinos both. We are both major supporters of this program. And they are a group of women who all live around the Balule Game Reserve, and that's what this says here, and from all communities right around it. They are hired to patrol the boundaries of the fence of the forest and look for poachers coming in to kill animals. They are unarmed. There is no guns around them. They are unarmed. They are armed with anti-sexism, I guess you'd call it. One of the reasons that they tell me why they are so effective as they are, and I'll tell you how effective they are in a moment, is because they are women in a camouflage uniform walking proudly through a game reserve where the big five, the most threatening animals in southern Africa, live and walk around on their own, and they are unarmed. And they go up to poachers and they say, "Excuse me, sir." No. It's always with a finger waggle. They're very good at that. Puts me in my place quite a bit. And men who aren't used to women in camo or driving or being on foot when all these dangerous animals are around are taken aback, and rather than confronting them, they just say, "Okay." And then they leave. It's a de-escalation of the conflict. Right? Rather than the Mambas being armed with semi-automatics, they are armed with their charm. And with charm, they save species. Pretty badass, right? There's some badass women. I love working with them. Major collaborators. Where they work in Balule, they have reduced snaring by 93% of all species. All species, not just rhinos, all species. And in a regime where rhino poaching happens with semi-automatic machine guns and big groups of guys, they've reduced rhino poaching by more than 50% with no guns, right? Because of the de-escalation of the conflict. Right? If we continually have bigger guns, bigger machines, bigger things. Poachers do the same, and then it becomes a war because everybody knows everybody's fully armed to the teeth, and you come out blazing. And then there's parentless families across the landscape. So, how else does community-based conservation engagement occur? Not just with making jobs and being, I should say one other thing too about the Mambas. The Mambas are all selected. There are now 42 of them, and they are all from different families, and they are the sole breadwinner in every one of their families. That's how they're chosen, right? And this is an area where unemployment for men, who are usually the ones who are employed, unemployment for men is around 75%, right? 75%. 3 of every 4 people do not have a job, a regular income. You know, they all are Cajun things. They grow tomatoes and sell them, or onions and try to sell them just to get some money. But 3 out of 4 do not have a job, right? And there are 42 women who have jobs, and they support their extended family, cousins, nephews, right? That is gonna build support for conservation, right? Education. Do not underscore, you cannot emphasize enough the importance of educating kids. Because kids change families, right? Many of you have kids. How many of you, we're going to be bold enough to say yes to this, how many of you have kids who have never had your opinions changed by your kids' opinions? Let's see. You are set in your opinions, and those kids have never changed your mind, right? Oh, baloney. We have one smart aleck in the back here. Kids change families, right? My father started recycling because I dogged him constantly when I was a kid. And he recycles for his entire company. He is the head of recycling for his entire substation of Detroit Edison in Detroit. He's an awesome guy. Similarly, sports, bringing kids in. This is a basketball team I got to star on. No, this is another great children's education thing. Amazing kids. Oh, God. Children of South Africa are some of the most fun people you could have around at a party, that's for certain, I'll tell you what. And in addition, other things that community-based conservation engagement does, we can build capacity among people who are in areas where education is too costly, too time prohibitive, too complicated to be able to educate themselves. So, myself and Mike, where's Mike in here? Did I crop you out of both? God. I cropped out. This is Mike's arm right here. That's Mike right there. That's his leg. This was just an automatic thing. I just chose this on PowerPoint. Sorry, Mike. Mike and I went down in May to Kenya, Kenyan flag, and Tanzania, and help build capacity among conservationists down there to be able to communicate with communities and collect data from those communities and ask them what matters to you, what would help you, how could we better work together as conservationists and communities. If you are a conservationist in anywhere and you're not working with the community, you're not really doing the whole of conservation, because you have to work with the communities to make things sustainable. These good folks have been working on doing social science surveys, going into the communities, thanks to the training that we did, and continue to do. I'm leaving the 1st of November. Is that next Friday? I think that's next Friday. For Botswana for a week, and then Zimbabwe for a week to do 2 week-long workshops there, just like we did in Kenya and Tanzania, to try to build that ability among conservationists to work with their communities. Because these people know, conservationists on the field, how important communities are. And if we can build that capacity among them, among those biologists, because almost all conservationists are biologists. I'm a reformed biologist. I feel like I'm in an AA meeting or something. They can be more successful. Communities can be better engaged. right? So really, let's engage communities. Let's not enrage them by advocating for killing poachers and shooting people who are trying maybe to get some food to feed their family. So, we're here in the fabulous Coachella Valley at the lovely Rancho Mirage Library and Observatory. We're not in Africa. We're not in the upper Gulf of California, although really you are. The upper Gulf of California used to come up here, right, up to almost what La Quinta, I think, was the northwesternmost extent of it in the past millennia. What can you do to help build community conservation? What can you do to help further this idea of community-based conservation engagement? There are so many things that's like, what will you do? Not what can I do, but what will you do? Because there's a lot of possibilities. First, this is the world. And with both of these, with both the rhino decline and the vaquita decline, these are both due to traditional Asian medicine. Entirely. So, talk to people from the countries that are the greatest consumers of that traditional Asian medicine. Encourage them to find alternative and very likely more successful and more effective ways to deal with their pain than rhino horn. Give them a couple aspirin, right? Let's flip, but really, engage with your community. Talk to the people who live around you. Because you know who's the third largest consumer of rhino horn based on confiscations? Any guesses? The US of A. We're the third largest. And ivory as well. And ivory as well. Thank you. Right? This is all black market, and so God only knows what the real numbers are, but based on confiscations, we're the third largest. Because we are wealthy, yo. We got a lot of funds, and so we can afford these expensive things, the swim bladder, the fish maw, and the rhino horn. And so if you want to trade in something that's going to appreciate in value, twice as valuable as gold. If you want to think about poaching, think of a rhino walking around with a sword of gold off its nose, and then double the value, because that's how the poachers see it. Oh, hey. That was fun. So, what will you do? So many things. Talk to people from range countries, including our own. Cut back on the use. Advocate against the use of this stuff. If you know of trafficking, if you see rhino horn being traded somewhere, or fish maw being traded somewhere, report it. Be our voice. Be the animal's voice. Also, if you are an educator, I have a great set of curricula to talk about these issues, specifically with rhinos. We have these wonderful conservation that are multidisciplinary. And contact me. I can connect you with this wonderful classroom and curricula for free. It's an awesome tool to use. Some examples of it. Read more about things. Donate to conservation. Support conservation projects. That's a no-brainer, right? I didn't say this at the front. The Living Desert Zoo and Gardens is the program lead for all of the conservation efforts on zoos and aquariums across all of North America. So if you would like to help support vaquita conservation and helping to build alternative incomes and livelihoods for the people of the Upper Gulf, contact us. Help us support that project. Help make that happen. San Felipe is a lovely place. Sustainable ecotourism is a great way to support local communities. Get some money back into the communities. Vote. Vote the environment. Legislation matters. Our leaders matter. Please support that. Then, in addition, there's, how many of you have a social media account of any kind? Come on, every one of you, raise your hands. You liars. You all do. Yeah. So, even texting. Talk to people. Message about it on social media. Talk about things that matter to you, that you're passionate about. Share your passion with your peers. Communities matter for conservation, and we need to empower those communities so that they can benefit by the work that we do as conservationists, because community-based conservation engagement is conservation. Thank you.